You probably don't recognize the flag behind me, but as this country tries to deal with its history of racism, I thought back to my time in another country that was struggling to find its way. I'm talking about South Africa, where centuries of white rule ended with the first multiracial election in 1994. I was managing editor at the CBS TV station in New York City. As the election approached, I told my boss that we should cover this important story. He told me to go. It was the most exciting assignment in my 40 years of television news. So the day before voting started, my team, a reporter, a cameraman, and I landed in Johannesburg, just the three of us, while networks were sending dozens of journalists to cover the story. The British and Dutch colonized Southern Africa in the 1600s, taking control over indigenous tribes that had no common language and often fought one another. In the late 1800s, war broke out between Britain and the Netherlands after huge deposits of diamonds and gold were discovered. Britain won and in 1910 consolidated all the land into the Union of South Africa. The whites were mostly Dutch-speaking Afrikaners. When their nationalist party took power in 1948, segregationist policies became law. Under apartheid, blacks, almost 90% of the population, were herded into so-called townships and inferior schools, got only menial jobs. Blacks and whites couldn't marry or socialize without coming under suspicion or worse. Protests were met with state-sanctioned violence, like the Sharpeville Massacre, where 69 people were shot to death. Organizations like the Majority African National Congress, the ANC, were banned. Its leader, Nelson Mandela, jailed in 1962, held for 28 years. But fears of a real revolution were growing, and other countries instituted trade embargoes. By 1989, South Africa's economy was crumbling, and under new President F.W. de Klerk, so was apartheid. Mandela was freed in 1990, and multiracial elections were scheduled for 1994, with Mandela as ANC's candidate. There was never any question that Mandela would win. The question was, how would the election go? That's where my story comes in. The morning after we arrived, our driver took us to the nearby town of Germiston, where a bomb had gone off at a taxi stand used by black residents, killing 10 people and wounding dozens more. White nationalists were determined to stop the election. As we filmed our reporter walking through the wreckage, my cameraman and I discussed what we could possibly show on TV. There were pieces of wreckage and body parts all over, even in the trees. I started to understand how war correspondents have to put their emotions aside, but they couldn't do the job. Despite it all, people were determined to vote.
I'm going to the polls. Irrespective of what's going to happen, I'm definitely going to vote.
And over the next 3 days, from April 26th to the 29th, they did. The first day of voting was set aside for the elderly, the sick, and the disabled. I have to admit, I was brought to tears seeing the way people brought out chairs to line the long route to the ballot booths so that those who couldn't stand for long would be able to move along from seat to seat until they were finally able to vote for the first time ever. And one man with sons in the U.S. told us what he would tell them.
I'll tell them that after 350 years, before I die, I voted. Now I can die even tomorrow.
5,000 international observers monitored the election, including this tracksuited fellow I got to know. Reverend Al Sharpton has changed a lot since then. I also got to spend time with children in the black townships, like kids everywhere, except that their futures were about to change dramatically. In all, almost 20 million people voted over the 4 days of balloting. They stood in packed lines for hours. In one case, we saw a white couple hand in hand with their black housekeeper, all of them smiling.
Bring me to vote, and then I went to New South Africa, and I love them both.
Yesterday, more than 1,700 people cast their first ever ballots at this Baptist church. Today, poll workers here and in many other parts of the country waited as voters trickled in a few at a time.
As expected, Mandela's ANC won overwhelmingly, with 62% of the vote to 27% for the National Party of de Klerk, who would go on to serve as Mandela's deputy, a remarkable peaceful transfer of power. The last thing we shot, services at a mixed-race church, and a song we here in the U.S. know well. I wish I could say it's all been sunny since then. Yes, millions of units of housing have been built for elderly and disabled black citizens, and the black South African middle class has grown substantially. But that's still only 5%, and 2/3 of the land is still owned by whites, although the government plans to seize some for reparations. But South Africa is a far more equitable country than it was 27 years ago. And I'm just very grateful that I was there at the beginning.